How does the son of the wisest king inherit a kingdom destined for ruin? The seeds of division were sown long before his crown. Young Rehoboam often watched King Solomon his father, a man once overflowing with divine wisdom, now burdened by unspoken regret. The grandeur of the palace a fading echo of his early devotion. What happens when a father's world-renowned wisdom is overshadowed by forbidden desires? The lessons Rehoboam learned were not always godly. Growing up, Rehoboam was surrounded by unparalleled splendor. The palace shimmered with gold, exotic animals roamed lavish gardens, and the air itself seemed to hum with his father's fame. Yet, amidst this opulence, a subtle shadow crept in. Rehoboam observed the constant influx of foreign wives, their vibrant customs, and the quiet construction of their altars within the very grounds of the city of God. What seemed at first like an extension of Solomon's worldly glory soon became a source of unease. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17 had warned kings against taking many wives, for they would surely turn their hearts astray. A young prince, Rehoboam witnessed this transgression unfold, perhaps not understanding its depth, but sensing a growing discord. The wisest man's final confession: everything is meaningless. How did this despair shape the son who would inherit his throne? As the years passed, the vibrancy faded from King Solomon's eyes. Rehoboam, now older, would often find his father in his private chambers, not immersed in statecraft, but in deep, solitary reflection. The king, who had once sought divine wisdom above all, now uttered words like those found in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2, meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. This profound melancholy, this weariness that had replaced his earlier vitality, was a stark contrast to the Solomon of legend. The narrator knows that this despair was the bitter harvest of a life that, despite its glorious beginning, had strayed far from God's commands, lost in the pursuit of worldly pleasures and forbidden alliances. Rehoboam, a silent observer, could only witness the profound sorrow etched upon his father's aged face. The Golden Age had a dark underside. What happens when a king's ambition drains his people dry? Rehoboam felt the tremors of discontent, driven by a burgeoning curiosity, or perhaps a nascent sense of responsibility. Rehoboam occasionally ventured beyond the palace walls, sometimes disguised, into the bustling marketplaces and common gathering places of Jerusalem. There, the whispers were not of Solomon's wisdom, but of weariness. He heard the common people grumbling about heavy taxes, the crushing burden of forced labor, and the endless demands to fund Solomon's lavish projects and maintain his numerous foreign alliances. He saw the weary faces of men returning from the quarries and the fields, their bodies bent under the strain, their meals meager. The narrator reveals that Solomon's immense enterprises, though bringing glory and wealth to the kingdom, had inadvertently sown deep resentment among the very people he ruled. This widespread unhappiness, a silent yet potent force, created an undercurrent of tension, a simmering discontent that Rehoboam could feel stirring beneath the gilded surface of his father's reign. From diligent worker to destined king, who was the man Solomon unknowingly elevated to be his son's greatest rival? While Rehoboam grew up in the gilded cages of the palace, another figure was rising through the ranks, forged in the heat and dust of Solomon's grand construction sites. This was Jeroboam, a man of the tribe of Ephraim whose diligence and exceptional capability did not escape the king's notice. Solomon, perhaps too distracted by his own spiritual decline, saw in Jeroboam not a threat but a valuable asset. He appointed this capable young man over all the labor of the house of Joseph, placing immense power and influence into his hands. Little did Solomon know, he was nurturing the very seed of his kingdom's division, unknowingly elevating the man destined to tear his legacy asunder. A torn garment, a shattered kingdom. Witness the moment God's judgment on Solomon's unfaithfulness was sealed and the future of Israel irrevocably changed. As Jeroboam traveled from Jerusalem one day, a fateful encounter awaited him on a secluded road. Ahijah, a prophet from Shiloh, known for his direct and uncompromising messages from the Lord, met him there. In a dramatic, divinely charged moment, Ahijah took hold of his new cloak and tore it into 12 pieces. "Take 10 pieces for yourself," he declared to a stunned Jeroboam, "for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 31. Ahijah explicitly articulated God's judgment against Solomon for his idolatry, for turning away from the Lord, and for worshiping the gods of his foreign wives. This prophecy, delivered with awe-inspiring conviction, laid bare the kingdom's future, an irreversible consequence of Solomon's unfaithfulness. A prince in hiding, a king's paranoia. How did a prophecy for division turn into a desperate hunt across kingdoms? The weight of Ahijah's words hung heavy over Jeroboam. Now aware of his destined role, he also knew the immediate danger. Solomon, hearing of the prophecy and perhaps fearing a coup, sought to kill Jeroboam. In a desperate flight for his life, Jeroboam fled from Israel, seeking refuge with Pharaoh Shechem in Egypt. There, in a foreign land, he bided his time, a king in waiting, while the once wise Solomon, consumed by fear, paradoxically attempted to thwart the very will of God he had once so humbly sought. The wisest king, consumed by fear. What secrets did Solomon keep that would unravel his kingdom and burden his son? Back in Jerusalem, the air within Solomon's palace grew thick with unease. Rehoboam, now older, observed his father's growing paranoia. He noticed the heightened security, the suspicious glances cast upon court officials, the subtle shifts in loyalty. Though Rehoboam remained oblivious to the specific prophecy delivered to Jeroboam, he could not ignore the palpable tension. Solomon's actions, born of God's anger, and the revealed decree of division, manifested as a king increasingly isolated, fearful, and acting out of a desperate attempt to cling to a kingdom already marked for judgment. Rehoboam witnessed the instability firsthand, a perplexing shadow falling over the once golden court. The greatest king is dead, but his legacy is a powder keg. How does Rehoboam prepare to rule a kingdom already marked for division? The end of an era arrived, not with the glorious fanfare of Solomon's youth, but with the quiet sorrow of a life that had strayed. In the hushed chambers of the palace, King Solomon breathed his last. Perhaps a final, weary glance toward his son, Rehoboam, conveyed an unspoken burden, a silent regret. His death was announced, ushering in a mixture of public mourning for the great king and private apprehension for the future. Rehoboam was immediately thrust into the role of king, not simply inheriting a throne, but the immense, unresolved weight of his father's tarnished legacy, a kingdom internally divided and externally threatened. The weight of a crown, the roar of a people. Can Rehoboam unite a kingdom on the brink, or will he shatter it with a single word? News of Solomon's death spread, and with it, a nervous anticipation gripped the nation. The people of Israel, burdened by years of heavy taxes and forced labor, gathered, expecting their new king, Rehoboam, to address their grievances. Rehoboam, still processing his father's passing, now grappled with immense political pressures. The future of a once united kingdom hinged precariously on his response to the people's plea. The stage was set, the audience expectant, the destiny of Israel awaiting one man's choice. The ancient city of Shechem, where covenants were made and where a kingdom would be broken. Rehoboam arrives to meet his destiny. The road to Shechem stretched long before Rehoboam, a path laden not just with dust, but with the immense weight of expectation and history. This was not merely a journey. It was a pilgrimage to a crucible. Shechem, hallowed ground where Abraham first built an altar to the Lord, where Jacob purged his household of foreign gods, and where Joshua renewed Israel's covenant with God, now awaited a new king. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, felt the eyes of all Israel upon him. His official coronation over the northern tribes was to take place here, a moment that should have been a triumphant affirmation of his rule. Yet, as his procession neared the city, the air thickened not with celebration, but with a palpable tension. He gazed out at the vast crowd, a sea of faces etched with both hope and apprehension, knowing that the impending decisions would not just define his reign, but perhaps the very future of God's chosen people. The voice of the people demanding change. Will Rehoboam listen to the pleas that could save his kingdom, or will pride prevail? The Shechem assembly grounds buzzed with an expectant hum as Rehoboam took his place on the raised dais. Before him stood not just an assembly, but the collective conscience of a nation. Then from the multitude a figure emerged, one whose very presence was a testament to Solomon's failing wisdom. Jeroboam returned from his exile in Egypt. He stepped forward, a spokesman for the people, his voice clear and resonant. "Your father," Jeroboam declared, "made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you." The collective affirmation of the people echoed his plea. They promised their loyalty, but on one condition: relief from the crushing burdens Solomon had placed upon them. Rehoboam, caught between the solemnity of his new crown and the urgent cries of his people, asked for 3 days to consider their request. The future of Israel, the united kingdom forged by David and expanded by Solomon, now hung precariously on that single deliberation. Ancient wisdom, a path to peace. Why did Rehoboam turn his back on the counsel that could have saved his kingdom? In a hushed, respectful tent away from the clamor of the assembly, Rehoboam first sought counsel from the elders who had served his father, Solomon. These were men whose faces were etched with the wisdom of years, who had witnessed the rise of Israel to unparalleled glory and the subtle beginnings of its spiritual decline. They understood the heart of the people and the delicate balance of leadership. Their advice was sagacious and conciliatory. "If you will be a servant to this people today," they urged him, "and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 7. They knew that true leadership wasn't about domination, but about service. A king who truly served his people would secure their unwavering loyalty, a bond far stronger than any imposed burden. Rehoboam listened, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a path to peace clearly laid before him. But would he choose it? When pride speaks louder than wisdom, how did the advice of his youthful friends lead a king to his ultimate downfall? Having heard the wisdom of the elders, Rehoboam then turned to another chamber, one filled with the boisterous energy of his peers, the young men who had grown up with him, accustomed to the palace's lavishness and the king's unchecked power. These were men whose perspectives were shaped by privilege, not by experience. Their counsel was swift, arrogant, and aggressive. "This is what you are to tell these people," they declared, emboldened by their own lack of foresight. "My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 10 to 11. Their advice was not to serve, but to dominate, not to lighten the burden, but to increase it. It was a counsel rooted in pride, a raw assertion of power that dismissed the people's suffering and the lessons of humility. As Rehoboam listened, his expression hardened, the seductive allure of absolute authority beginning to eclipse the quiet wisdom of the elders. The fate of a kingdom rests on one man's choice. Which voice will Rehoboam heed, the wisdom of age or the arrogance of youth? Alone in his private tent at Shechem, under the silent gaze of the desert moon, Rehoboam wrestled with the two starkly contrasting counsels. The elders offered peace and enduring loyalty through humility and service. His young friends promised absolute power and unquestioning obedience through intimidation and oppression. The weight of his father's legacy pressed down on him. Solomon, the wisest king, had started with humility but ended in spiritual compromise, his heart led astray by worldly desires. Now Rehoboam stood at his own crossroads, mirroring his father's earlier choices, albeit with a different temptation. Should he secure his reign with kindness, or with an iron fist? The decision would not only define his character, but would irrevocably carve the destiny of an entire nation. His heart pounded, anxious and conflicted, as the climax of his reign approached. One king's pride, one kingdom's fall. The Shechem assembly grounds hummed with expectant whispers. The harsh midday sun beating down on thousands of faces turned towards their new king. Rehoboam, rigid on his dais, felt the weight of every eye, yet allowed the counsel of his youthful advisers to harden his resolve. He had been given a choice, compassion or domination. Tragically, he chose the latter. With a voice that echoed across the vast assembly, a voice filled with an arrogance that would shatter a nation, Rehoboam delivered his catastrophic reply. "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 13 to 14. These were not just words. They were a death knell for a united Israel. The crowd's expressions shifted, from hope to disbelief, then to simmering anger. This was a divinely orchestrated moment, a direct consequence of Solomon's unfaithfulness, where the son's pride became the instrument of God's judgment. Witness the exact words that tore Israel apart, fulfilling a prophecy spoken years before. The roar of rebellion! In an instant, the simmering discontent ignited into a furious inferno. Rehoboam's arrogant words had struck a nerve, an insult too profound to bear. A unified cry erupted from the northern tribes, echoing through the tumultuous assembly grounds. "What portion have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse." "To your tents, O Israel," 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 16. Banners bearing the Lion of Judah were torn down, standards trampled underfoot. The thousands who had gathered to crown a king now dispersed in a surge of righteous fury, their faces etched with a sense of irreversible separation. This was it. The tribes of Israel, 10 of them, were returning to their homes, rejecting Rehoboam's authority. This chaotic, decisive moment confirmed the direct fulfillment of Ahijah's prophecy, underscoring God's sovereign hand in the rending of his chosen people. This is the sound of a kingdom shattering, the price of tyranny, a tax collector stoned, a king in panicked flight. Rehoboam, stunned by the ferocity of the rebellion, made one last, desperate, foolish attempt to assert his authority. He sent Adoram, the official in charge of forced labor, to address the angry crowd. It was a fatal error. The Israelites, seething with years of resentment, met Adoram not with words, but with a hail of stones. The brutal stoning of the man responsible for their oppression was a chilling, undeniable sign of their complete rejection. Rehoboam, his face etched with terror, barely escaped with his life, scrambling into his chariot and speeding away from Shechem back to Jerusalem. In that desperate flight, he finally grasped the gravity of his mistake, the irreversible breach he had caused. How quickly power can crumble when a people rise up. From exile to king, with Rehoboam in panicked retreat, the northern tribes knew their next step. They sent for Jeroboam, the capable leader who had championed their cause, the very man Ahijah had marked for kingship. He had returned from Egypt, a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. Now, in a newly convened assembly, perhaps in Shechem or another northern city, the 10 tribes of Israel formally made Jeroboam their king. Cheers erupted. A new banner was unfurled, symbolizing the dramatic birth of a divided Israel. Jeroboam accepted the crown, a mixture of triumph and the daunting task ahead. The narrator highlights how this moment irrevocably sealed the fulfillment of Ahijah's prophecy, the permanent split of the once united kingdom, a new order emerging from the chaos. Witness the coronation of Jeroboam as the leader of a new nation. War averted by a prophet's word. Rehoboam, now confined to Jerusalem, was not one to concede defeat easily. Consumed by anger, he swiftly gathered 180,000 chosen warriors from Judah and Benjamin, intent on marching north to reclaim his lost kingdom by force. But God's divine hand was not finished. Shemaiah the prophet intervened, a lone figure standing before the mustering army, delivering God's uncompromising message. You must not go up and fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this thing is from me. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 24. Despite his frustration, Rehoboam and his army obeyed, recognizing the divine authority behind the prophet's words. War was averted, but the division was confirmed. Discover why God himself declared the division of Israel, and what it meant for both kings. A kingdom fortified, a heart divided. How did Rehoboam, Solomon's son, continue his father's spiritual decline, even with the temple in his midst? After the shattering division at Shechem, Rehoboam, now king only of Judah, turned his attention to securing what remained of his fragmented realm. From Jerusalem, he embarked on an ambitious program of fortification, building and strengthening cities like Bethlehem, Hebron, and Gath, preparing Judah for the inevitable conflicts to come. His early reign saw a period of strengthening, a practical response to a kingdom under siege. Yet, despite having the sacred temple of the Lord within his borders, a place of true worship, Rehoboam's heart was not fully devoted to God. The creeping shadows of his father Solomon's later years, filled with foreign altars and compromised faith, began to darken Judah's spiritual landscape. To keep his kingdom, Jeroboam defied God. Witness the shocking creation of the golden calves that led an entire nation astray. Meanwhile, in the newly formed northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam faced a different, yet equally profound challenge. His fear was palpable. If his people continued their pilgrimage to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices in the Lord's temple, their hearts would surely turn back to Rehoboam, the king of Judah. This political anxiety became a spiritual poison. Consulting his advisors, Jeroboam made a catastrophic decision, one that would redefine Israel's worship for generations. He proclaimed, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 28. He then set up 2 golden calves, one in Dan in the north and one in Bethel to the south, creating new religious centers. He appointed priests who were not of the Levitical line, and established new feast days, completely altering God's divine commands for worship. A king's fear, a nation's fall. See how one man's compromise cursed generations and led Israel into spiritual darkness. Jeroboam's actions were born of fear and political expediency, yet their spiritual cost was immeasurable. His establishment of the golden calves became the, quote, sin that caused Israel to sin, a devastating legacy that would plague the northern kingdom throughout its existence. With no central place of true worship and a king who actively promoted idolatry, the 10 tribes of Israel abandoned the covenant God had made with their ancestors. They severed their connection to the Lord, embracing false gods and defiling themselves with practices explicitly forbidden. This profound apostasy set a pattern for future kings of Israel, leading generation after generation down a path of spiritual ruin and divine judgment. The once chosen nation had traded God's presence for golden idols. Even in God's own city, the shadow of unfaithfulness lingered. How did Rehoboam's Judah fall prey to the same temptations as his father? While Jeroboam led Israel into overt idolatry, Rehoboam's Judah, though retaining the temple and the legitimate priesthood, was far from spiritually pure. The Bible records in 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 22 that Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They, too, built high places, sacred pillars, and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree, engaging in the very pagan practices that God had commanded their forefathers to eradicate from the land. It was a disheartening echo of King Solomon's later years, a testament to the pervasive influence of sin. Rehoboam inherited not just a throne, but the spiritual failings of his father, demonstrating how easily a heart, even in the presence of God's truth, can stray. Brothers turned enemies. Witness the bloody borders where the once united people of God fought each other, a tragic legacy of one king's pride. The spiritual compromises of both kings were not isolated to their hearts. They bled into the very land they ruled. The division of the kingdom fostered an environment of constant tension and bitter conflict. Across the newly drawn borders between Judah and Israel, skirmishes and warfare became an unfortunate norm. The once united people of God, brothers by covenant and blood, now faced each other as enemies, spilling each other's blood in futile battles. The tragic irony was profound. A nation chosen by God to be a light to the world was now divided against itself, its strength diminished, its spiritual fervor compromised, and its future shadowed by persistent strife. The prophet's chilling curse witnessed the moment God's judgment fell upon Jeroboam's dynasty. a devastating consequence of leading a nation to idols. Years passed, and the northern kingdom of Israel continued its descent into spiritual darkness under Jeroboam's leadership. Then a shadow fell upon his own house. His son, Abijah, fell gravely ill. In desperation, Jeroboam sent his wife, disguised, to the aged, blind prophet Ahijah in Shiloh, hoping for a word from the Lord concerning his son. But God had already spoken to Ahijah. As Jeroboam's wife approached, the old prophet, though sightless, recognized her by the Spirit. He declared in a voice heavy with divine authority, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why do you pretend to be someone else? I have been sent to you with a harsh message." Ahijah then pronounced a terrifying judgment from the Lord, recorded in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 7 to 16. Because Jeroboam had done more evil than all who were before him, making other gods and provoking God to anger, his entire house would be utterly cut off. The Lord will sweep away the house of Jeroboam as one sweeps away dung until it is all gone. This was the bitter harvest of a king who traded faithfulness for political security, leading a nation to idols. The burden of a bad decision. In his final years, did Rehoboam ever truly understand the cost of his pride? A king's sorrowful reckoning. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, King Rehoboam lived out his years, reigning over the diminished kingdom of Judah. Perhaps in his private chambers late at night, a weary Rehoboam gazed over the moonlit city, the very walls he had fortified, and reflected on the irreversible choices that had defined his reign. Did he recall the earnest counsel of the elders at Shechem, the wisdom he had so haughtily dismissed? Did the loss of the 10 northern tribes, the constant skirmishes along the border, and the spiritual struggles within his own kingdom weigh heavily on his aging heart? His father, Solomon, had ended his life with the haunting lament of meaninglessness, a poignant echo of a heart that had strayed. Rehoboam, too, though not reaching the heights of Solomon's initial wisdom, had inherited not only the throne, but also the spiritual compromises that plagued his father's later years. He had begun with arrogance, and while his reign saw periods of fortification, it was also marked by a divided heart, never fully devoted to the Lord. In the quiet solitude of his final days, we can only imagine the weight of regret for a kingdom torn apart by his pride. From pride to prophecy fulfilled. How did the choices of 2 kings doom their dynasties and shape the destiny of a nation for centuries? The choices made by Rehoboam and Jeroboam at the dawn of their reigns set in motion a historical trajectory that would shape Israel for centuries. In Judah, the Davidic line, though often featuring unfaithful kings, continued to rule, a testament to God's covenant with David. Yet even Judah succumbed to periods of idolatry and moral decay. In the northern kingdom of Israel, however, Jeroboam's devastating prophecy was fulfilled with chilling precision. His dynasty was indeed cut off, replaced by a rapid succession of kings, often through violence and intrigue. Every subsequent king of Israel followed in the sins of Jeroboam, establishing calf worship and leading the people further away from God. Ultimately, both kingdoms, weakened by division and spiritual compromise, would face the devastating consequences of sustained disobedience, leading to their captivities and the scattering of God's people. The legacy of a divided house. How did one king's pride leave a scar on God's people that would last for centuries? The lessons are timeless. The story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam is a heartbreaking chronicle of division, a wound that never truly healed. The people of God, once united under the splendor of Solomon's reign, remained fractured for generations, constantly at war with one another. The spiritual compromises of both kings led to cycles of sin, judgment, and ultimately, the tragic exile of a chosen people. It serves as a poignant, powerful reminder of the profound cost of disobedience to God's commands and the devastating impact of disunity within His community. The very nation God had called to be a light to the world became a divided house, a testament to human frailty and the consequences of turning away from divine wisdom. The ultimate lesson from Rehoboam's downfall. It's not how you start, but how you finish. What choices will you make today? What can we learn from the bitter harvest reaped by Rehoboam and Jeroboam? Their stories implore us to seek God's wisdom above all else, to guard against pride, and to value humble counsel. It reminds us that blessings can be squandered, and a good start does not guarantee a faithful finish. Our true purpose lies in fearing God and keeping His commandments. May we strive to remain faithful to God until the very end, learning from the mistakes of kings and embracing the path of true wisdom.